Jaden adjusted his suit as he walked through the airport terminal, his FBI badge tucked securely in his pocket. It had been a long week of undercover work, and all he wanted was a quiet, uneventful flight home. As he stepped into first class, he took his assigned seat by the window and exhaled deeply. Finally, a moment of peace. Blairl strutted into the cabin, dragging her designer suitcase behind her. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped impatiently on the handle as she scanned the rows. She spotted her seat, next to a black man. Her smile faltered. She hesitated. The flight attendant greeted her with a polite nod, but Blairl barely acknowledged her. Instead, she turned, her voice just loud enough for others to hear. "Excuse me, there must be a mistake. I need a different seat." The flight attendant glanced at the ticket. "This is your assigned seat, ma'am." Blairl's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm not comfortable sitting here. Surely you can move me somewhere else." Jaden, who had been looking out the window, slowly turned his head. His dark brown eyes met Blairl's gaze. He recognized the expression, the kind that said, "You don't belong here." The passengers nearby stole glances, sensing the tension. The flight attendant hesitated, looking between Blairley and Jaden. "Ma'am, the flight is fully booked," she said, her tone firm but professional. "We can't move you." Blairl's cheeks flushed as she realized people were watching. She let out an exasperated sigh and dropped into her seat, making sure to put as much distance between herself and Jaden as possible. Jaden didn't react. He had seen this before, too many times. He turned back to the window, knowing this flight was going to be anything but peaceful. The plane's engines hummed, vibrating through the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. Blairl's discomfort was almost tangible, her body rigid, her breathing controlled but sharp. She stared straight ahead, but her mind burned with irritation. The presence beside her felt wrong, like something that shouldn't be there. As the flight attendant moved down the aisle, Blairl's patience snapped. She shot up from her seat, her sudden movement drawing the eyes of those around her. The polished air of first class faltered, the murmurs of quiet conversations fading. "Excuse me?" Blairl's voice had an edge now, something brittle yet sharp. The flight attendant turned, a slight frown forming as she approached again. Jaden didn't move. He remained still, composed, his gaze fixed on the raindrops streaking the window, blurring the world outside. Blairl's pulse pounded. This was wrong. A feeling lodged deep in her chest like an unbearable weight. The attendant's response was firm but rehearsed, professionalism coating every syllable. "Ma'am, we cannot change your seat." The words hit like a slap. Blairl's breath hitched. A flicker of something hot and unfamiliar curled in her stomach. Was it embarrassment? Anger? Her face warmed as she felt the weight of the cabin's eyes, watching, analyzing, judging. A lump formed in her throat, but before she could push further, a shift beside her made her freeze. Jaden reached into his jacket. For the first time, her heartbeat wasn't from anger, but fear. The air inside the cabin grew heavy, thick with the unspoken weight of scrutiny. Blairl's heartbeat slammed against her ribs as she watched Jaden's hand slip into his jacket. The moment stretched, tense, suffocating, an eternity compressed into mere seconds. She had seen this before, or at least she thought she had. The news cycles, the whispered warnings, the deep-rooted fears she had never questioned. Every muscle in her body tensed, waiting for... what? Her breath hitched, and then a wallet. Sleek, professional, nothing like she expected. Jaden pulled it out effortlessly, slipping a card between his fingers before tucking the wallet away, not even sparing her a glance. Heat flushed her cheeks. Her mind scrambled for an anchor, a way to justify what she had felt. But the realization clawed at her. The problem had never been him. It had been her. A subtle shift in the cabin. Passengers who had pretended not to listen suddenly found their books and screens fascinating. The flight attendant's polite smile now held something sharper. Disapproval? Amusement? Pity? Blair couldn't tell, but the humiliation sank deep, searing into her skin. She wanted to shrink into her seat, to disappear into the hum of the engines. But no, she was trapped here. Trapped in her own discomfort, forced to sit beside the very man she had deemed unworthy. And he hadn't said a single word. The plane ascended, pressing passengers back into their seats. Blair clenched the armrest, her knuckles white. But it wasn't the altitude making her uneasy. It was the silence beside her. A silence so profound, so loud, it gnawed at her insides. Jaden didn't shift, didn't sigh, didn't even acknowledge her presence. He sat composed, unreadable, as if she were nothing more than empty space beside him. The realization stung in a way she couldn't explain. The flight attendant passed by, offering drinks, but Blair barely heard her. Her mind replayed the last few minutes in an endless loop. The way she had stood, demanded, expected the world to shift for her comfort. And yet, she was the one exposed, unraveled. She stole a glance at Jaden, expecting, hoping, to find something in his expression. Indignation, smugness, even anger, anything. But there was nothing. Not a flicker of reaction, no sign that her presence even registered. And somehow, that was worse. She shifted in her seat, crossing her legs, uncrossing them. Every movement felt unnatural, forced. The walls of first class seemed to close in, suffocating her with a weight she couldn't shake. For the first time in her life, Blair felt small, and the man beside her hadn't lifted a single finger to make her feel that way. The plane soared higher, but Blair had never felt so low. The rhythmic hum of the engines filled the space between them, yet the silence between Blair and Jaden felt deafening. The weight of unspoken truths pressed against her chest, each second stretching longer than the last. She had always felt in control of her surroundings, of the way people responded to her. But now the balance had shifted, not because of anything he had done, but because of what she had assumed. Her fingers drummed against the tray table, an unconscious habit she couldn't seem to stop. Across the aisle, an elderly woman stole a glance at her, the faintest ghost of a knowing smirk tugging at her lips. She had seen it all unfold. Blair stiffened. The uncomfortable realization settled in. No one had come to her defense. No sympathetic nods, no validating murmurs. Not a single person had agreed with her. And yet, Jaden remained unreadable, untouched. While she sat there unraveling thread by thread, he remained composed, effortlessly indifferent. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, jolting the cabin. Blair's stomach twisted, but it wasn't from the sudden dip. It was from the unsettling truth sinking in. She had been so certain, so convinced of her own perspective, and yet, in a matter of minutes, the very ground beneath her beliefs had begun to crack. For the first time, Blair wasn't afraid of Jaden. She was afraid of what this meant about herself. The world outside the window stretched endlessly, clouds rolling beneath them like an untouched canvas. But Blair couldn't admire the view. She was trapped in a moment she couldn't undo, drowning in the echoes of her own choices. She had always believed she understood the world, that she knew who she was, what was right, what was expected. But sitting here, with the weight of a silent judgment she had cast upon herself, she realized how small her perspective had been. Her fingers traced the cool edge of the seatbelt buckle, an anchor in a storm of realization. She had spent years curating a world where she was always right, always justified. But now she wasn't sure. Jaden hadn't reacted, hadn't challenged her, hadn't even needed to. His silence had spoken louder than any confrontation ever could, and yet, here she was, shifting uncomfortably, while he remained a pillar of composure. Blair Lee inhaled sharply, as if oxygen alone could cleanse the tightness in her chest. But no amount of deep breaths could erase the truth that had settled in. She had expected him to be the problem. Instead, she was staring at her own reflection, and she didn't like what she saw. The plane surged forward, steady, unbothered. Unlike her. The plane moved steadily through the sky, cutting across endless layers of clouds. Yet inside the cabin, Blair felt as if she were sinking, the weight of her own thoughts pulling her under. She had never questioned herself like this before. Her beliefs had always been clear, her judgments swift and justified. But now, sitting beside a man she had deemed unworthy of her presence, without reason, without logic, she felt something foreign. Shame. It wasn't the kind that came from being caught. No, this ran deeper. This was the shame of realizing she had been wrong long before today, that this moment wasn't an exception, but a pattern she had never bothered to see. Jaden had barely moved, his posture composed, his focus elsewhere. He carried himself like someone who had been here before. Had he? Had he sat through moments like this all his life, feeling the weight of unspoken bias, of quiet exclusions? Blair swallowed hard. She had thought he would be the one to make her uncomfortable. Instead, it was the mirror he unknowingly held up to her, the one forcing her to confront the kind of person she had been all along. The plane continued forward, but Blair was no longer certain where she was headed. The plane's steady hum filled the silence, but Blair's thoughts were anything but calm. She shifted in her seat, unsettled, restless, yet unable to pinpoint why. The discomfort wasn't from the flight. It was from something deeper, something she hadn't been ready to face. She had spent so much time believing the world worked a certain way, that people like her belonged in places of comfort while others didn't. But now, sitting here, trapped in the reality of her own bias, she felt exposed in a way that no audience, no public scorn, could ever match. Jaden still hadn't reacted, still hadn't given her a single glance of acknowledgement. His stillness unnerved her more than any confrontation ever could. He wasn't trying to prove a point. He wasn't arguing, because he didn't need to. Blair's fingers gripped the armrest, but there was no turbulence to blame, only her own realization. Her world had always been so black and white, so certain. But now, it blurred. For the first time, she wasn't sure where she stood, if she even liked the person she had been standing as all this time. The flight continued forward, smooth, uninterrupted. Unlike her mind, she had been so desperate to escape sitting beside him. Now, she wondered, had she really been running from him, or from herself? The cabin air felt heavier than before, as if the very atmosphere had shifted. Blair sat still, her hands resting on her lap, but inside she was anything but calm. A storm raged within her, silent yet undeniable. She had always believed she understood people, their intentions, their worth, their place in the world. But now, in the presence of someone she had dismissed before even knowing him, she felt something she never expected. Doubt. Jaden remained unreadable, his expression carrying the kind of stillness that came not from ignorance, but from experience. He wasn't ignoring her. He simply didn't need to acknowledge what had happened, because this was nothing new to him. That realization hit harder than anything else. This wasn't her moment of awakening. This was just another day for him, another instance in a lifetime of quiet prejudices, unspoken discomfort, and people like her making him feel like he didn't belong. Blair's chest tightened. Had she ever stopped to think about what it was like to exist in a world that constantly questioned your place in it? To always be met with hesitation, with judgment, before a single word was spoken? She exhaled, slow and measured, yet the weight in her stomach didn't lift. She had wanted him to be the problem, but she was starting to realize maybe she had been all along. The air inside the cabin was cool, yet Blair felt a strange warmth creeping up her neck, a heat that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with awareness. For the first time, she wasn't seeing the world through her own carefully built lens. She was seeing it through his silence, through the weight of what he didn't say. Jaden sat composed, his presence effortlessly commanding respect without demanding it. He didn't need validation, nor did he seek it. He had long since learned that some people's discomfort was not his burden to fix. Blair's fingers curled slightly. This was what unnerved her the most. She had spent years believing that people like him had something to prove, some expectation to meet. But here he was, existing as he was, unapologetic, unbothered, undeniable. The seatbelt light flickered off, yet she remained motionless. For once, her instinct to move, to create distance, failed her. Distance wouldn't change what had already been revealed. She had refused to sit next to him. She had let her prejudice shape the moment before it even began. And now, she sat there, forced to face the truth that had been there all along. It wasn't him she had been running from. It was the version of herself she could no longer ignore. The hum of the airplane engines filled the silence between them, steady and unbroken. Yet inside Blair, there was nothing steady, only a storm of thoughts unraveling faster than she could control. She had spent her life moving through the world with an unquestioned sense of belonging, never stopping to wonder how different it must feel for someone like him. But now, the very seat she sat in felt unfamiliar, as if she no longer fit inside the version of herself that had boarded this plane. Jaden remained composed, flipping through a document as if nothing had happened. Because to him, nothing had. That was what struck her the most. This wasn't a moment for him. It was a moment for her. A mirror held up to everything she had ignored. She thought back to her initial reaction, the instinctive rejection, the silent superiority she had worn like an invisible crown. But that crown felt heavy now, its weight pressing down on her conscience, suffocating in a way she had never known before. She exhaled sharply, eyes shifting toward the window. The world outside stretched endlessly, cloudless and open, unbiased, free, unlike the walls she had built inside her own mind. For the first time, Blair wondered, what if she let those walls come down? The plane soared forward, cutting through the sky, yet Blair felt as if she were sinking, not into fear, but into a realization she couldn't escape. Her entire life, she had moved without questioning the space she occupied. She had assumed her comfort was a given, a right she didn't have to earn. But now, sitting beside Jaden, she understood something far heavier than she had ever allowed herself to acknowledge. She had been wrong. Not just today. Not just on this flight. But always. Jaden turned a page in his folder, his posture effortless, his focus unwavering. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that needed no approval, and that was what unsettled her the most. He had faced her judgment and hadn't flinched, because her opinion had never mattered. Blair's pulse drummed beneath her skin. Her mind replayed the way she had pulled away from him, the way she had let an unspoken bias dictate her actions. And yet, in his presence, she didn't feel condemned. She felt exposed. Her fingers tightened around the armrest. Outside, the world stretched endlessly, vast and untouched. A reminder that the space she had guarded so fiercely had never belonged to her alone. She inhaled, deep and slow. Maybe for the first time she was ready to listen. The plane moved effortlessly through the clouds, but Blair's mind was tangled in a storm she had never faced before. She had always thought of herself as polite, well-mannered, fair, the kind of person who never spoke hate, never acted cruelly. But today had proved something different. Sometimes prejudice wasn't loud. Sometimes it was silent. It was in the instinct to pull away, in the refusal to share space, in the way she had assumed she was better without ever saying a word. Jaden, still calm beside her, had given no reaction, because he didn't need to. He had lived this moment before, in 100 different ways, with 100 different people. She was nothing new. That truth hit her harder than she expected. Her nails dug into her palm, a weak attempt to ground herself. The plane's cabin suddenly felt smaller, as if her own discomfort was pushing back at her, forcing her to acknowledge it. For the first time, she wanted to escape herself. She turned toward the window, the sky stretching out like an infinite canvas. It had no borders, no divisions, just possibility. Blair swallowed hard. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change. The hum of the airplane engines felt distant now, drowned beneath the weight pressing against Blair's chest. She had spent years believing she was open-minded, progressive, fair, that she treated everyone the same. But here she was, feeling exposed by nothing more than a man's quiet presence beside her. Jaden had done nothing, and yet he had unraveled her. She wasn't sure which was worse, the realization that she had been wrong, or the fact that he had expected nothing different. Her stomach twisted at the thought. How many times had he experienced this? The silent rejection, the unspoken bias, the way people claimed they weren't the problem but still acted like they were. She clenched her fingers against the seat, trying to shake the suffocating feeling crawling up her spine. She had always seen herself as the kind of person who knew better, but today she wasn't sure if she even knew herself. Outside the window, the horizon stretched wide, endless, free of judgment. A stark contrast to the world she had built inside her mind, a world where she had always been on the right side of things. But maybe she hadn't been. For the first time, she wasn't just uncomfortable. She was ashamed. And shame was something she didn't know how to escape. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, pressing against Blair's chest like an invisible force she couldn't shake. It wasn't the plane. It wasn't the altitude. It was her. She had spent her entire life believing she was different, better than the ones who openly judged, the ones who spoke their prejudice out loud. But silence was its own kind of betrayal, wasn't it? She had refused to sit next to Jaden, maybe not with words, but with her body, her hesitation, Her instinct to create distance. That was enough. Her fingers curled into her lap as she stole a glance at him. Jaden sat unfazed, his focus somewhere beyond the moment, beyond her. There was a quiet strength in him, the kind that didn't beg for acknowledgement. He had lived through this before. People like her had made sure of that. Blair swallowed hard. She had thought that her discomfort was his burden to bear, that her hesitation was just a passing moment. But now, sitting beside him, feeling the weight of her own guilt, she realized she had been the problem all along. And the worst part? Jaden already knew. He always had. Blair stared at her reflection in the small, oval airplane window, but the person looking back felt unfamiliar. The turbulence outside mirrored the storm inside her. She had always thought of herself as fair, kind, accepting. The kind of person who didn't judge, who wasn't part of the problem. But wasn't that the biggest lie of all? Her body had betrayed her mind today. That small flinch, the hesitation, the instinct to create space. She wanted to believe it was just habit, just social conditioning, just a moment of unconscious bias. But excuses felt empty now, because she had felt it, real, undeniable discomfort. And worse, she had seen the flicker of recognition in Jaden's face, the way he didn't react because this wasn't new to him. How many times had he watched people do this? How many times had he been made to feel like an outsider in places he had every right to exist? Blair exhaled sharply. She wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. She was angry, not at Jaden, not even at society, at herself. Because if she, someone who thought she was different, could still fall into the same patterns, then how deep did the problem really run? And what did that say about the world she lived in? The reflection in the window blurred as the plane tilted slightly, but the truth had never been clearer. The hum of the airplane engines filled the silence between them, a steady rhythm against Blair's racing thoughts. The world outside the window was endless, vast, open, limitless. But inside, she felt caged by the weight of her own realization. She had spent years believing she was separate from the problem, that her silence was neutrality, not complicity. But now, sitting beside a man who had probably lived through a lifetime of quiet rejections like hers, she understood. Prejudice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was in the unsaid words, the unspoken discomfort, the micro moments that built invisible walls between people. Her fingers traced the edge of the armrest, her body finally at ease in the seat she had once refused. But her mind wasn't at peace. Jaden's presence wasn't the problem. Her own biases were. She let out a slow breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought about every moment she had dismissed, every assumption she had made, every excuse she had used to convince herself she was different. But was she? Or had she just been lucky enough to never confront the truth about herself? The truth was here now, sitting right beside her, steady and unwavering. And for the first time, Blair wasn't looking away. She couldn't. She wouldn't. The reflection on the airplane window wasn't just Blair's face. It was a version of herself she no longer recognized. The woman who had stepped onto this flight had carried an invisible shield, a barrier built from years of ignorance. But now, cracks had formed, and through them, the light of reality was seeping in. Her mind flickered back to childhood memories, dinners at her parents' house, hushed conversations, comments passed off as jokes, the kind of words that planted small, unnoticed seeds. She had never questioned them, never challenged them. Had she always been this blind? Her pulse quickened. She had been raised to believe that success was built on merit, that the world was fair if you worked hard enough. But what about people like Jaden? People who had to work twice as hard just to be seen, let alone succeed. She dared a glance at him. He wasn't even looking her way. His focus remained steady, a quiet confidence in his posture. He wasn't proving anything to anyone, because he didn't need to. Blairl felt something stir in her chest. Guilt? Awareness? The weight of unlearning was heavy, but it was a burden she had to carry. She turned her gaze back to the window, watching her reflection blur against the sky. For the first time, she didn't recognize the person staring back, and maybe that was a good thing. The hum of the plane was steady, but Blairl's mind was anything but. Each moment felt like an echo, bouncing inside her head. Jaden's calm, the weight of her own ignorance, the sharp contrast between the two. She had been so quick to assume, so unwilling to see beyond her own narrow view of the world. Her fingers gripped the armrest. The tension in her shoulders wasn't from the flight. It was from the truth settling into her bones. The memories that had once seemed insignificant were now loud, refusing to be ignored. She had laughed at certain jokes, nodded along to things that should have made her uncomfortable. Was that complicity? The realization burned. Jaden, on the other hand, remained composed. Not because he didn't notice, but because he had lived through worse. He had no reason to seek validation. He knew who he was. And in that knowing, there was a strength Blairl had never seen before. Not in herself, not in the world she had built around her. She exhaled slowly. Awareness wasn't comfort. It was raw, unfiltered, and demanding. It required change, and change meant confronting the past. The question was she ready? The seatbelt sign blinked overhead. The turbulence wasn't just in the air. It was inside her. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of the discomfort. She was afraid of what would happen if she ignored it. The descent had begun. The plane tilted slightly, and the city lights below stretched like a vast, glowing web. Blairl's heartbeat matched the rhythm of the blinking runway markers, uneven, anticipatory, restless. Jaden remained unfazed, his eyes scanning a document on his phone. The weight of his identity didn't sit on his shoulders the way Blairley had once imagined it would. He carried it with an ease that came not from privilege, but from a lifetime of knowing the world wouldn't always be fair. Blairley, on the other hand, felt exposed. The layers of ignorance she had wrapped around herself had been stripped away, leaving only raw awareness behind. She thought of the countless glances, the hushed tones, the discomfort she had once dismissed. How many times had she ignored the shifting energy in a room? How many times had she been the one to create it? The plane touched down with a jolt, pulling her back into the present. The wheels screeched against the tarmac, and for a moment, everything was still. Then came the rush, the exhale of an entire cabin relieved to be grounded. But Blairl wasn't grounded. She was free-falling into something she didn't yet understand. As passengers stood, gathering their things, Blairl hesitated. What came next would define everything. The seatbelt light clicked off. The real journey had just begun. Blairl stepped into the airport terminal, the artificial glow of fluorescent lights casting a sterile sheen on the polished floors. She had walked through airports 1,000 times before, but today, every detail felt magnified. The way people moved, the fleeting glances, the unspoken biases woven into the fabric of society, she saw it all now. Jaden walked ahead, his stride steady, unbothered. But Blairl knew better now. He wasn't unbothered. He was used to it. For the first time, she noticed the security officer's subtle double-take as Jaden passed, the way an elderly woman clutched her purse a little tighter when he walked by. These weren't loud acts of prejudice. They were whispers, quiet, insidious, ever-present. Blair swallowed hard, her throat dry. How had she lived so blindly? As they reached the baggage claim, Jaden finally turned to her. His eyes held no anger, no resentment, just patience. A patience that spoke of years spent waiting for the world to catch up. Blair exhaled. This was her moment of truth. She could pretend she hadn't seen, hadn't felt, hadn't changed, or she could step forward, not just beside Jaden, but into his world, into the truth that had been there all along. She took a step, a small one, but in the right direction. Blair had always believed she understood the world. She had read articles, watched documentaries, even had conversations about privilege and prejudice. But none of it compared to the weight she felt now, the weight of awareness. As they left the airport, the cool breeze of the city night brushed against her skin, but it didn't wash away the unease in her chest. The world hadn't changed. She had. She could see it now. In the way a cab slowed but hesitated before pulling up when Jaden stepped forward. In the cautious glances, in the unspoken discomfort that seemed to trail behind him like a shadow. And yet, Jaden carried himself like none of it mattered. Because for him, this wasn't shocking. It wasn't new. It was just another day, another moment, another reminder that the world was still learning what he had known all his life. Blair clenched her fists. She wasn't okay with this. Not anymore. As they slid into the cab, her reflection in the window stared back at her. Same face, same features. But behind her eyes, something had shifted. This wasn't just about Jaden. It wasn't just about one moment on a plane. This was about every moment after it. And Blair knew. There was no going back. The city lights blurred past as the cab moved through the streets. But Blair's mind wasn't in the present. She was replaying everything. The judgmental stares, the uncomfortable silences, the way people hesitated around Jaden as if he were a threat, rather than the protector he had sworn to be. She stole a glance at him. He was relaxed, looking out the window, his expression unreadable. Did it not bother him anymore? Had he grown so accustomed to this reality that he had learned to carry it without breaking? Blair couldn't imagine it. Couldn't imagine living in a world where she had to fight for respect that should have been hers from the start. Her hands curled into fists. She thought about the woman on the plane, about the entitled way she had dismissed Jaden, not even knowing who he was. But that was the thing. Why should it take knowing his title for her to respect him? Why did power and status have to be the price for dignity? Her stomach twisted. This was an unseen battle, one fought every single day in glances, in whispers, in barriers that weren't always visible, but were just as real. And Blair knew now, silence was never an option. The air inside the courtroom felt heavier than the walls that enclosed it. Every eye was on Jaden. Not as a respected officer, not as a man who had dedicated his life to justice, but as a black man standing in a space where power had never been built for him. Blair sat still, her breath shallow. She could hear the murmurs, the shifting of papers, the calculated glances exchanged between attorneys who had already decided how this case should end before it even began. But Jaden? He sat tall, his back straight, his eyes unreadable. He wasn't afraid, because fear had no place here, not when the truth was on his side. Yet Blair knew the truth wasn't always enough. not in a world that preferred the comfort of its own illusions over the discomfort of accountability. The judge's voice rang through the room, calling the session to order. The prosecutor rose, walking with the kind of arrogance that came from knowing the system had always tilted in his favor. Blair clenched her fists. They thought this would be easy. They thought Jaden was just another case. But they had no idea what was coming. Because the weight of truth? It was heavier than any lie they could craft. The courtroom held its breath as the first piece of evidence was presented. A grainy video. At first glance, it was just another clip. Shaky hands holding a phone, muted voices in the background. But as the footage played, the silence in the room turned deafening. There it was, raw, undeniable. The officer's mocking words, the aggression disguised as authority. The moment Jaden was pushed, provoked, not as a suspect, but as a man they had already condemned in their minds. Blair's chest tightened. She knew what was coming next. The defense team remained still, as if absorbing the weight of what had just been laid before them. The judge's face betrayed nothing, but the jury? They weren't expecting this. Jaden sat motionless, watching as the past replayed in front of him. He wasn't angry. He had burned through anger long ago. What remained was something far more dangerous, a quiet certainty. Because the truth wasn't just out. It was about to dismantle everything they thought they could get away with.